I was under a lot of pressure at work during that time and felt like I was about to break. So I decided to take a few days off and rented a secluded Airbnb cabin deep in the countryside. I thought getting away from the city and spending some time in the woods would be the perfect way to clear my mind. The cabin looked perfect in the photos, surrounded by trees, quiet, and far from everything. It was exactly what I needed, a peaceful retreat, away from the noise and chaos of people, traffic, and work. When I arrived, I was pleased. The cabin was small but clean and well-maintained. The thing I liked most about it was the large floor-to-ceiling window in the master bedroom, which gave a clear view of the forest outside. Every tree, every leaf seemed so close. During the day, sunlight poured in, filling the room with warmth and a touch of nature. The first night passed without incident. I fell asleep quickly, feeling more relaxed than I had in a long time. But things took a strange turn on the second night. After dinner, I climbed into bed early with a book, planning to read for a bit before sleeping. The forest was peaceful, the only sounds coming from the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It was close to midnight when I began to feel a little drowsy, and I decided to turn off the lights. Just as I was about to do so, an unsettling feeling crept over me, like someone was watching me. I turned my head toward the large window. At first, I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary, just the dark night and the faint outlines of the trees. But then I spotted it, a vague figure standing behind one of the trees, not far from the cabin. My heart immediately started pounding. I told myself it was nothing, probably just a trick of the shadows. But that figure didn't move. It stayed perfectly still, like it was observing me from the woods. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, a figment of my tired mind playing tricks on me. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I kept staring at the figure, unable to look away. To confirm it wasn't just my imagination, I grabbed my phone and tried to take a photo of the woods outside. But every time I aimed the camera at the figure, it seemed to disappear from view. The screen showed only darkness. But when I lowered the phone and looked with my eyes, the figure was still there. I began to rationalize. Maybe it was a hiker passing through or a local resident. But why would someone be standing in the woods so still in the middle of the night? And why were they watching my cabin? I felt more and more uneasy, so I decided to close the curtains, hoping to block out the unsettling sight. But as I pulled the curtains shut, a new fear gripped me. What if that person was already approaching the window? What if they were just inches away from the glass, hidden behind the thin fabric? I forced myself to calm down. I locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and told myself that everything was fine. Yet, no matter how hard I tried to relax, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Lying in bed, I stared up at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The forest outside was too quiet, the kind of quiet that only deepened my anxiety. Then, in the silence, I heard it, a faint tapping sound, like someone gently knocking on the window. It wasn't loud, but in the stillness of the night, it echoed through the room. My heart raced again. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or maybe a tree branch brushing against the glass. But then it happened again. That unmistakable tap, tap. I couldn't take it anymore. I leapt out of bed, turned on every light in the cabin, and cautiously approached the window. My hand trembled as I pulled the curtain back, just a tiny bit. Nothing. The figure was gone. I stood there, staring into the darkness for what felt like an eternity, trying to process what had just happened. Eventually, I convinced myself that it had to be my imagination. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me after all. But the fear wouldn't leave. I stayed awake the rest of the night, watching the clock, waiting for the first signs of dawn. When daylight finally broke, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Everything seemed normal again. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling from the night before. I decided to spend the afternoon in town, hoping that being around people would help calm my nerves. When I returned to the cabin just before sunset, I noticed something strange right away. The grass near the window looked disturbed, as if someone had been walking there. The flattened blades of grass led from the woods straight to my bedroom window. My heart began to pound all over again. Someone had been there last night. The figure I saw wasn't a trick of the light. Someone had been standing there, watching me. I grabbed my things and called the host, making up an excuse about an emergency back home. I left that cabin as fast as I could, driving for hours until I reached a hotel in a nearby town. A few days later, I received a message from the host. The next guests had arrived and noticed even more footprints around the cabin, circling the house, as if someone had been walking around it during the night. To this day, I have no idea who or what was out there in the woods, but I do know that someone or something was watching me that night, and the thought of it still sends a chill down my spine. A few months ago, my girlfriend and I decided to rent an Airbnb in a quiet little town in Northern California for a peaceful weekend getaway. The house was an old, 3-story Victorian-style home, full of character, with a charm that made it feel like a relic of another time. The town was small and serene, surrounded by towering forests and winding roads, as if we were miles away from the rest of the world. The host had mentioned that the second floor and the attic of the house were off limits, leaving only the first floor for us to stay in. While he was polite about it, I couldn't help but notice a slight hesitation in his voice when he brought it up, as if there was more to the story. We arrived in the late afternoon with the sunlight filtering through the trees and casting long shadows on the house's weathered brick walls. It was beautiful, but something about the place felt a little heavy. Once we got settled inside, everything seemed fine. My girlfriend turned on the TV, and I headed to the kitchen to prepare dinner. The old wooden floors creaked lightly under my feet, a subtle reminder of the house's age. That evening, after we had finished eating, we relaxed in the living room, watching a light-hearted movie and chatting about our plans for the next day. But just as we were about to turn off the TV and head to bed, we suddenly heard a soft but distinct sound coming from above us. Footsteps. I glanced up at the ceiling, feeling a small knot of anxiety tighten in my chest. The second floor and attic were supposed to be empty, so what could be making that noise? My girlfriend frowned and asked, "Did you hear that too?" I nodded, now fully aware of the growing unease. "It's probably just the house settling," I tried to reassure her and maybe myself too. Old houses make all sorts of noises, right? We turned off the TV and got ready for bed, but in the middle of the night, I woke up with a strange feeling that something wasn't right. The room was pitch black, and the only sound outside was the wind rustling through the trees. I turned over, trying to go back to sleep. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps, louder this time, slow and deliberate, coming from directly above us. This wasn't just the house creaking. Someone or something was walking upstairs. My heart started to race, and I sat up, holding my breath as I listened closely. The footsteps continued, sometimes stopping for a few seconds, then starting up again, as if whoever was up there was pacing back and forth. I broke out in a cold sweat. "This doesn't sound like the house settling," my girlfriend whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, my mind racing. I grabbed my phone and used its dim light to guide me as I got out of bed and made my way to the hallway. I had to see what was going on, even though every instinct was telling me to stay put. As much as I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, the footsteps were too real, too steady to ignore. I cautiously approached the staircase that led to the second floor, shining my phone's flashlight up the steps. The hallway at the top was cloaked in darkness. I stood at the bottom of the stairs for a moment, hesitating, before I finally took a deep breath and began to climb. The wooden steps creaked loudly under my weight, each step feeling more ominous than the last. When I reached the second floor, the hallway was completely empty, no sign of anyone or anything that could have made the noise. I scanned the area with my phone's light, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. At the far end of the hallway, the door to the attic was slightly ajar. We hadn't touched that door since arriving, and I distinctly remembered the host saying that the attic was off limits. Yet here it was, open, as if someone had just passed through it. My heart was pounding in my chest, and a wave of dread washed over me. I stood frozen for a moment, debating whether to investigate further, but every fiber of my being was screaming at me to leave it alone. I backed away, quickly retreating down the stairs and returning to the bedroom. I told my girlfriend what I had seen, and her face went pale. "Let's just go first thing in the morning," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. That night, we barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside felt like it was coming from something more sinister. I lay awake, eyes wide open, waiting for the next sound, half expecting to hear the footsteps start up again. But they didn't. Instead, the house seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with a tension we couldn't shake. At dawn, we packed our things quickly, not wanting to spend another minute in that place. As we left the house and walked toward the car, I couldn't resist the urge to glance back at the second-floor windows. For just a moment, I thought I saw something. Some shadowy figure standing behind the glass, watching us. But when I blinked, it was gone, and the window was empty. Even after we had driven away from that house, the unsettling feeling stayed with me. It was as if something or someone had been there the entire time, watching us from the shadows, making its presence known through those unnerving footsteps. I can't explain what happened in that house, and maybe I don't want to know. But every now and then, when the night is quiet and I'm alone with my thoughts, I still hear those footsteps echoing in my mind. And I wonder, were we ever really alone in that house? It happened last autumn. I rented a house on Airbnb in the mountains, planning to spend a few days alone. It was an old house with decades of history, wooden walls, a large porch, and surrounded by dense forest. The host told me that cell signal was poor in the mountains, but the house had Wi-Fi, so I could stay connected through it. The house was located in a very remote area. There were no other residents nearby, and the surroundings were so quiet that I could only hear the sound of wind rustling through the leaves. At first, I enjoyed the silence. It felt refreshing to get away from the hustle and bustle of the city and finally relax. I spent the afternoon reading on the porch, the cool mountain breeze making it feel quite pleasant. As the evening fell, I went inside to prepare dinner. That night, I sat in the living room watching TV. The show wasn't very engaging, and my attention was instead drawn to the darkness outside the window. I hadn't pulled the curtains, and the forest loomed outside, shrouded in shadows. Just then, I suddenly heard a sharp cry for help in the distance. The voice was faint and low, like it came from far away, echoing eerily through the woods. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but the sound was too clear, carrying a tone of desperation that sent chills down my spine. I immediately turned off the TV and stood up, walking to the window to peer outside. The world was silent, save for the soft rustling of branches in the wind. I opened the window, letting the cold night air in, and strained to listen. But the cry never came again. I felt a bit uneasy, but I convinced myself that it might have been the wind or some animal making the noise. After all, it was common to hear strange sounds in the mountains. So I closed the window and returned to the couch, trying to focus on the show again. A few minutes later, my phone suddenly buzzed. I looked down and saw that I had received a text message from an unknown number, just a series of garbled symbols. The message content was simple: "Can you hear me?" I felt a bit puzzled. Maybe it was a wrong number, but considering how poor the signal was up here, it was strange to even receive a message. I decided to ignore it, thinking it must be a glitch. But not long after, the phone buzzed again with a new message: "Help me." My heart started pounding. The content of the text matched the cry I had heard earlier. I began to feel anxious, but I still tried to convince myself it might be a prank. I picked up my phone and called the host, wanting to check if there might be someone nearby who needed assistance. The phone rang a few times, then cut off without anyone picking up. I frowned and tried again, but it went straight to voicemail. Just then, every light in the house suddenly went out, plunging the entire place into complete darkness. Panic set in. I stood frozen in the dark, the only light coming from my phone's screen. The room seemed to press in on me, with the darkness distorting the shapes of familiar objects, casting eerie shadows that looked like they could come alive at any moment. I steadied my breathing, telling myself it was just a power outage, nothing to be afraid of. But just then, another text appeared on my phone. "I'm right outside your door." My heart nearly stopped. Cold sweat broke out across my forehead as I stared at the words on the screen, feeling a bone-chilling fear seep through me. The house was so quiet that I could hear the sound of my own frantic heartbeat. I turned slowly to look at the front door. It was locked, and there was no way anyone could have gotten in. I tried to tell myself it was just a cruel joke, but the thought of something, standing just outside the door filled me with dread. After a few seconds, I finally mustered the courage to move closer to the door. Every step felt heavier, my legs trembling. I leaned forward, peering through the peephole. All I saw was pitch-black darkness. The porch was empty, not a single movement outside. I let out a shaky breath, momentarily relieved. Maybe I was just overthinking things. Maybe it really was just a prank. I turned back, about to step away, when my phone buzzed again. Another message. "Why didn't you open the door?" I nearly dropped my phone. There was no way. I had just looked outside, and there was nothing there. How could this message know I was watching through the peephole? The fear overwhelmed me like a tidal wave, and I felt nauseous, my skin prickling with a sensation of being watched. I couldn't stand it any longer. I grabbed my bag and car keys and bolted out of the house, fleeing as fast as I could. The car roared to life, and I sped down the narrow, winding mountain road, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they turned white. I didn't dare look back, too afraid I might see someone, in the rearview mirror. I drove for nearly an hour before I finally reached the nearest town, with dawn beginning to break. I checked into a small inn and spent the rest of the night there, still trembling. The next morning, still shaken, I asked some of the locals about that house. An elderly woman listened quietly as I described what had happened. When I finished, she hesitated, then told me that a couple used to live in that house years ago. Apparently, the couple had a strained relationship. One day, the wife mysteriously disappeared, and the husband fell into despair and guilt. A few months later, he hanged himself in the house. The police searched every corner of the property but never found the wife's body. Ever since then, everyone who stayed in that house reported hearing strange cries for help or receiving bizarre messages. I never went back to that house, nor did I ever contact the host again. I don't know what really happened that night, but I'm certain that something was in that house, watching me. Something that was waiting for me to open that door. That's today's story. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe to my channel, and turn on the notification bell. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.